The blood on her hands wasn't hers. Sarah McKenna stood in the doorway of the Silver Dollar Saloon, moonlight catching the crimson stains across her palms like dark paint. Behind her, 3 men lay sprawled across the card table, their chips scattered like fallen stars. The poker game had ended badly, for them. Jesus, Sarah. Jake Morrison stepped from the shadows of the alley, his deputy's badge catching what little light filtered through the dusty windows. He'd been watching her for weeks now, drawn to something he couldn't name, something dangerous. She turned slowly, her green eyes holding secrets deeper than any mine shaft. They had it coming, Jake. All 3 of them. The way she said his name made his chest tighten. Sarah McKenna wasn't like the other women in Copper Ridge. The preacher's wife with her pressed dresses, the schoolmarm with her gentle hands, the saloon girls with their painted smiles. Sarah wore men's clothes, carried a Colt .45, and could outshoot half the men in town. She owned land, made her own money, and answered to no one. What happened in there? Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the gunpowder on her clothes, the whiskey on her breath. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs. They were wrong. The desert wind howled between the buildings, carrying the scent of sage and something darker, the metallic tang of violence that seemed to follow Sarah wherever she went. Jake had heard the stories, how she'd killed her first husband in self-defense, how she'd run off 3 suitors who'd tried to claim her ranch, how she lived alone on 200 acres with nothing but her horse and her ghosts. The sheriff's going to want answers, Jake said, though his hand hadn't moved toward his gun. Couldn't move toward his gun. Sarah smiled then, a slow curve of her lips that held no warmth. "Thon, I'm not like other women, Jake. I don't run from trouble. I end it." Something in her voice made him take a step back, but his heart hammered forward. He'd been circling her for months like a moth drawn to flame, knowing she'd burn him, wanting the heat anyway. Behind them, footsteps echoed on the wooden boardwalk, heavy boots, multiple pairs. Sarah's hand moved to her holster with practiced ease. "Looks like we're about to have company." Sheriff Coleman emerged from the shadows with 4 men flanking him, their faces grim in the lamplight. Jake recognized them all, businessmen, ranchers, the kind of men who made decisions for other people, whether they wanted them made or not. "McKenna?" Coleman's voice carried the weight of authority and something else, fear. "We need to talk." Sarah's fingers never left her gun. "About what?" "About the fact that you just killed 3 of the most prominent citizens in this territory." Coleman stepped closer, his own weapon still holstered, but his intentions clear. "About the fact that this town's had enough of your particular brand of justice." Jake felt the moment crystallizing around him like frost on morning glass. He could step aside, let justice take its course, whatever that meant, in a town where justice was bought and sold like cattle, or he could stand with Sarah and risk everything he had built as a lawman, everything he'd sworn to protect. "They drew first," Sarah said, her voice steady as stone. "Self-defense. That's not what the witnesses say." Coleman's hand drifted toward his Colt. "They say you provoked them, called them out for cheating at cards, then shot them down when they objected." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Jake had seen the whole thing through the window, watched the 3 men corner Sarah, watched them reach for their guns when she'd refused their advances. But saying so would mark him as clearly as taking her side in a gunfight. "Witnesses can be mistaken," Jake heard himself say. The words surprised him as much as they surprised Coleman. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, calculating the betrayal, the shift in loyalty that could change everything. "You sure about that, Deputy Morrison?" Coleman's voice carried a warning clear as church bells. "Your word against 3 upstanding citizens? Against the testimony of half a dozen witnesses?" Sarah turned to look at Jake then, and for the first time since he'd known her, something like vulnerability flickered behind those green eyes. She'd fought alone for so long that the possibility of an ally seemed to catch her off guard. "I'm sure," Jake said, stepping closer to Sarah's side. The businessmen behind Coleman murmured among themselves, their voices carrying words like conspiracy and corruption. Jake felt his future reshaping itself with each whispered accusation, felt the life he'd carefully built, crumbling like sandstone in a flood. But when Sarah's shoulder brushed against his arm, when he caught the faint scent of her hair beneath the gunpowder and whiskey, he knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. Coleman's hand settled on his gun grip. "Then you're both under arrest." The sound came first, hoofbeats drumming against hard-packed earth like distant thunder. Then the dust cloud rising against the star-scattered sky, growing larger with each passing second. Jake counted at least a dozen riders, maybe more, coming hard toward Copper Ridge's main street. "McKenna's got friends," one of Coleman's men whispered, but Jake knew better. Those weren't friends riding in. They were sumped. Hing much worse. Sarah's face had gone pale as moonlight. The Garrett brothers. Jake's blood turned to ice water. Everyone in 3 territories knew about the Garretts, a clan of outlaws who'd carved a bloody path across the Southwest, leaving burned ranches and unmarked graves in their wake. But what would they want with Sarah? "You know them?" Jake asked, though the answer was already written in the tension of her shoulders, the way her free hand trembled against her thigh. "They're my dead husband's kin." Sarah's voice was barely audible above the approaching thunder of hooves. "They think I killed him for his land. They've been hunting me for 2 years. Coleman and his men had forgotten about arrests and justice, their attention fixed on the growing dust cloud. In the frontier, family vengeance trumped local law every time, and the Garretts were known to settle their debts in blood. "How many?" Coleman asked, his authority already cracking under the weight of approaching violence. 5 brothers, maybe more cousins." Sarah checked her ammunition with practiced efficiency. "They won't leave witnesses, Sheriff. They'll burn this whole town to find me." The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Jake could see the riders now, dark shapes against the night, moving like a plague of locusts across the desert. They rode hard and fast, the kind of men who had learned to kill before they'd learned to read. "We could give you up," one of Coleman's men suggested, his voice shaking. "Trade you for the town's safety." Jake's gun was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to draw it. The barrel pointed directly at the speaker's chest. "Anyone touches her goes through me first." Sarah looked at him, then with something like wonder, as if she'd never seen loyalty before, never understood that someone might choose to stand with her when running would be easier. The riders were close enough now that Jake could hear their shouts, could see the glint of metal in the moonlight, close enough to see the rope one of them carried, a hangman's noose already tied and ready. "They're not here for arrest," Sarah said quietly. "They're here for execution." Coleman backed toward the saloon's entrance, his men following like shadows. Only Jake remained beside Sarah in the street, his gun steady despite the fear coursing through his veins like poison. The Garretts pulled up 20 yards away, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust. The lead rider dismounted slowly, deliberately, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim. When he looked up, Jake saw eyes like chips of black ice, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. "Evening, Sarah." The man's voice carried the weight of old grudges, old pain. "Been looking for you." "Hello, Thomas." Sarah's grip on her gun never wavered, but Jake caught the slight tremor in her voice. "Still blaming me for something that wasn't my fault." Thomas Garrett stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster. "My brother died the night he married you, found shot through the heart in his own bedroom. You expect me to believe that was coincidence?" For the first time since Jake had known her, Sarah's mask slipped. Pain flickered across her features, raw, unguarded emotion that hit him like a physical blow. "He was drunk," she whispered. "Angry. He came at me with his fists, then his gun. I defended myself." "Liar." Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. "Marcus was a good man, a gentle man." Sarah laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. "Gentle? Ask the horses he beat. Ask the ranch hands he terrorized. Ask the women in town who crossed the street when they saw him coming." She reached into her shirt pocket with her free hand and withdrew something small, a piece of paper, folded and refolded until the creases had worn soft as cloth. With careful fingers, she opened it and held it out. "He wrote this the day we married," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Read it, Thomas. Read what your gentle brother really was." Jake couldn't see the words from where he stood, but he watched Thomas's face change as he read, watched certainty crumble into doubt, watched old beliefs collapse under the weight of new truth. The paper trembled in Thomas's hands. This isn't Marcus's writing." "It is." Sarah's voice was steady now, filled with quiet strength. "Every threat, every promise of what he'd do to me if I ever tried to leave. I kept it as proof, but who would have believed me? A woman's word against a dead man's reputation?" Thomas looked up from the letter, his eyes no longer chips of ice, but mirrors reflecting pain. "He said you seduced him, said you married him for his money, then killed him when he found out. I married him because my father owed him money, and Marcus offered to forgive the debt in exchange for a wife." Sarah folded the letter carefully, returned it to her pocket. "I never wanted his money, Thomas. I just wanted to live." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Jake felt the moment balancing on a knife's edge, felt the future of everyone in Copper Ridge hanging on what Thomas Garrett decided to believe. She's telling the truth. The words came from Jake without conscious thought, but once spoken, he couldn't take them back. Thomas Garrett stood frozen in the dusty street, the letter's revelations warring with 2 years of certainty. Behind him, his brothers shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands near their weapons, waiting for the word that would turn the night into a bloodbath. "You don't know anything about this law, man," Thomas said finally, but the venom had leaked out of his voice. "I know her," Jake replied, surprised by the truth of it. He'd thought he was drawn to Sarah's mystery, her danger, but standing here facing down death, he understood it was something simpler and more complicated. He knew her heart. "I know she's not a killer by choice." Sarah looked at him, then with eyes that held decades of pain, decades of fighting alone. "Jake, I know you're not like other women," he continued, his voice carrying across the silent street. "You're stronger. You've had to be. And that's why—" He paused, the words catching in his throat like fishhooks. "That's why I want you. Not despite what you are, but because of it." Thomas crumpled the letter in his fist, his face a battlefield of emotion. "Marcus was my brother. And he was my nightmare," Sarah said softly. "But he's gone, Thomas. We can keep killing over it, or we can let the dead stay buried." For a long moment, the only sound was the desert wind sighing through the buildings, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Then Thomas Garrett did something Jake never expected. He holstered his gun. "Mount up," Thomas called to his brothers without taking his eyes off Sarah. "We're done here!" "Tom, you can't just—" one of them started. "We're done," Thomas repeated, his voice carrying final authority. As the Garretts rode away into the darkness, Sheriff Coleman emerged from the saloon, his face a mask of confusion and relief. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose there's no crime in self-defense after all." Jake knew it was Cole. Iman's way of saving face, of pretending the last hour hadn't revealed exactly what kind of man he really was. But Jake didn't care about politics anymore, didn't care about his badge or his reputation or anything except the woman standing beside him. Sarah turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "You could have died. So could you." Jake reached out slowly, carefully, and took her hand. The same hand that had been stained with blood an hour ago, now clean in the moonlight. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah McKenna." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd ever seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. "Good," she whispered. "Because I'm not like other women. I don't let go of things worth keeping." Years later, when Jake was sheriff and Sarah was his wife, when their children played in the yard of the ranch they'd built together, he would remember this moment, the night she'd stood against the world and he'd chosen to stand with her. But for now, in the fading dust of Copper Ridge's main street, it was enough to hold her hand and know that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the right one. The moon set behind them as they walked toward tomorrow, two shadows becoming one against the endless western sky. Stories like this aren't just told, they're felt. If you felt it too, subscribe and stay with us.